Yes, Matthew chapter 24. Wow. I mean, that's just my first really big word for you, big theological word. I'll say it again. Wow. I'll say it backwards. Wow. Jesus. I mean, is this the same Jesus that gave us the Sermon on the Mount and the blessed are you and all the Beatitudes? Because we did the woes. Last chapter was the woes, and that was just a warm-up for this. Oh, if you were able to attend or join us online for Holy Thursday, I did a short message on how do you picture Jesus. And I put up some of the most famous paintings or portraits of Jesus. The one by Salmon, he's an American artist, 1940, the head of Christ. Salmon's head of Christ is so popular, there's probably 500 million reproductions of that painting now. So we often think of him that way. But many of you called or contacted me later to say, I never knew Rembrandt did a head of Christ. So the picture of Jesus by Rembrandt, and if you haven't seen it, if it doesn't come to mind, just type that into your computer. Rembrandt's Jesus. You can see more humanity in his face, and I mentioned even kind of two sides. You see in his complexion, one side of his face is very light. Not even maybe a hint of a smile, so there's no Mona Lisa imagery there, but the other side of his face is more in the shadows. And so you kind of have this both and about Jesus in that painting, but you see that in the Gospels. In Matthew particularly, you see both the lightness and the emphasis on love and mercy, Jesus, the forgiving Jesus. But there's this shadow a bit on his complexion and certainly his preaching. By the time we get to the last week of his life here, Matthew chapter 24, you kind of see a little bit of the darker side, the insistence on God's judgment, or might put it in this characterization. He's preaching justice. Ultimately, God will make everything right. And in order to do that, boy, you're going to step on some toes, right? There's going to be a lot of people who are caught up in the tribulation and the pain of that. So, yes, it's the same Jesus from Matthew 5 and the wonderful Sermon on the Mount. Jesus has both the mercy and the justice in his message. Let's dive right into the first verse, Matthew 24. As Jesus came out of the temple, so this is right before he goes to the cross, by the way, the last time that he's at the temple. He comes out of the temple and was going away. His disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. Then he asked them, "You see all these, do you not? Truly I tell you, not one stone will be left upon another. All will be thrown down." He was sitting on the Mount of Olives. The disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will this be? And what will be the sign for your coming of the end of the age?" Jesus said, "Beware that no one leads you astray, for many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Messiah,' and they will lead many astray. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you're not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All this is but the beginning of the birth pangs." Remember the temple. The temple was the headquarters for the politics and religion of the day. And it had stood for centuries. This was the second temple. The temple during the day of Jesus was the second one that was built. The first one was destroyed in the middle of the Old Testament times. So the one that they're looking at and thinking about, not one stone left on another, how could it be? That temple had stood since Ezra and Nehemiah days in the Old Testament, nearly 600 years, approximately the year 516 BC to 70 AD. Just a few years, well, about a generation after Jesus goes to the cross. This prophecy must have shocked the disciples. The stones themselves were huge. No one could imagine them being moved. If you've been to the Wailing Wall, if you've been to Jerusalem, you can understand they're perplexed at this idea of anyone destroying the temple. Now, try to think about a modern day equivalent. If to just try to experience the shock value of what Jesus said to those original hearers listening to his sermon. We might say the White House. You could think about, in our time, what if somebody said the U.S. Capitol would be destroyed and not one stone on another? That would be insulting, very difficult for us, for our national identity. But not even the the wonderful buildings in D.C. really approximate what the temple meant to the Israelites of that day. It was all of their history, all of their current identity. Today, our identities are, they're kind of farther between, let's say. We all know how important Washington, D.C. is to us, but there's not quite the spiritual connection or identity for us as Christians. So imagine that and more, as if somebody wiped off the map our Washington, D.C. It's much more than that. Now, Jesus is giving a prophecy here, and it's quite serious. And it did come to pass in the lifetime of those disciples who heard him, because the year 70 AD is when the Romans sacked Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, and so on. But understand this view of biblical prophecy that I've shared with you before. It's not only that it was true and came to pass in that reality, we know it from history, but my view of biblical prophecy is that it's past, present, and future. So there was a reality for what Jesus was talking about, even in the moment of him speaking. It had to do, to a degree, of him predicting his own death and resurrection, and they will see him return from the dead in power. That's part of it. It's a reality in our day and time, our present, and there is a future reality to this prophecy, that there will be an end time, that there will be a second coming of Christ. All of these levels of interpretation and fulfillment are valid and kind of worth your time thinking about. All right, prophecies of the ends of times, the end of the age, or Armageddon, as we've heard it because of the connection in Revelation with that place. These are very frequent occurrences in history that Christians all through the last 21 centuries have talked about and predicted and thought that they were inferring from the current events, the news of the day, the natural disasters or wars or what have you, that it must be the end times. And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm just saying Christians have always done that, and we'll probably always keep doing that. One day we'll be right. One day it'll come to pass, so that's fine. But there always have been these, what did Jesus say, verse 7? Nation rise against nation, we still see that. Nation states at war together today. Somebody just a couple of Sundays ago pulled me aside right before the worship service at Galilee and said, and I can't remember if he was pointing to something happening in our nation or the war between Russia and Ukraine, but he goes, Jason, don't you know, I think Christ is coming soon. And I gave him what is my favorite response. I'm not a Mennonite, but I've had some wonderful Mennonite friends. The two-word response of the Mennonites, I think, is sufficient. Perhaps today. I mean, why not? I think the point, if you don't get anything else out of chapter 24, you could use those two words. Perhaps today. Why not imagine Christ returning and being ready for that? I mean, that's really the point, is to be ready so that you can say also, perhaps today. Nobody knows, but why not? So is it the end times? Well, Jesus certainly paints a picture of that here. Remember, he's nearing the cross. He predicted it would be the end of the world as they knew it, with the end of the rule of the temple, not the end of Judaism or Jerusalem itself. It's not a judgment. Remember, take these words carefully. It's not anti-Semitism. But it is a major change in how people will relate to God directly through Christ after Jesus' death and resurrection, and certainly after the passing of the temple religion, the Pharisees as leaders, all of that diminished, obviously, without the temple. Verse 9, they will hand you over to be tortured, put you to death, and you'll be hated by all nations because of my name. Then many will fall away and will betray one another, hate one another. Many false prophets will arise and lead many astray, and because of the increase of lawlessness, the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. And this good news of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. Well, we put together, not just Matthew, but in the Bible as a whole, a collection of certain writings we call apocalyptic. Talking about the apocalypse, remember it's a Greek word, simply means revelation. It doesn't mean the end of the world, but that's how we take it. And ultimately, these prophecies certainly talk about a very drastic change in the way that we live our lives. And if you follow Revelation, and we've talked about that, going through that, it is not precisely clear, but a lot of biblical scholars or preachers try to put down a timeline and so on, how the tribulation happens, pre-trib, mid-trib, post-trib, all these different things, right? I don't think that's our concern here, nor is Jesus trying to say that in this. But you can look at those texts if you want. Go back and revisit Daniel and Ezekiel in the Old Testament, Matthew chapter 24, Mark chapter 13, and the book of Revelation. What you really put together, my estimation would be this. People will suffer. Well, not to take away anything from a more difficult time to come that we might term the tribulation, but people always suffer, right? I mean, there's always difficulty, and God helps us through it. But I would think the caution for us in Jesus' sermon here is verse 12, that the love of many will grow cold. May that not be you. May your heart not grow cold, but endure. Now, the word endure, or the Greek in English is best translated patient endurance. We found this just through and throughout the verses of Revelation. We see it in many of the Gospels and other New Testament writings. Patient endurance. So if you've ever been a parent or a grandparent, and you've seen children go astray or go through difficulty, and you've just got to, as my father-in-law said to me when I was a new father, you've just got to love them through it, right? That's the patient endurance in a way, that God has patient endurance with us and our misbehavior or difficulty in believing. And so we will have to patiently endure hard times, and that's the way of salvation. So I think that that's the underlying message. Jesus is making it pretty clear here. But we also learned that in the church, during the times of suffering or tribulation, there are going to be internal divisions among believers. So the church will not be as unified as God would want. Have you ever known that to be the case? Sure. So we're going through that now. It could be that Jesus returns tomorrow, perhaps today. We don't know. But the point is, Jesus was right when he talked about all these things, and it will be difficult, quite honestly. Most of the times, things are difficult for Christians. Even today, in other parts of the world, not here in America, but in other parts of the world, yes, there are Christians who are enslaved. There are Christians who are persecuted. There are Christians who are put to death for their faith, and there often have been. The worst persecution was probably right after Jesus' death and resurrection and up through the first century of the young Christian church. The forming of Christianity differentiated from Judaism. A lot of persecution in that time. So think about what you have to endure, and it might pale in comparison to what some other Christians have to endure. So take heart and stiff upper lip and all that, right? All right, so the good news, and Jesus said it right here in verse 14. So the church, even though it's divided in some ways, always less than perfect and way too human, the church will continue to proclaim the gospel. This is a little foreshadowing of Jesus' resurrected speech where he gives the Great Commission. Go and teach all nations, all kinds of people. So he mentions that right here. So that's a big deal. The church will not fail, even as imperfect and difficulties that we face and all this, divisions and all this. The church will still be actively engaged in its ultimate mission, which is to share Jesus Christ with the world. So that's good news. So let us not let our love grow cold. Let's endure, and let's keep actively doing what Jesus says. Now, here comes one of the most controversial paragraphs. Let me just get to it. Verse 15. When you see the desolating sacrilege, you may have heard it translated in different ways, but let's just go with this. The desolating sacrilege, spoken of the prophet Daniel, standing in the holy place, temple. Let the reader understand. Those in Judea must flee to the mountains. The one on the housetop must not go down to take things from the house. The one in the field must not turn back to get a coat. Woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing infant in those days. Pray that your flight might not be in winter or on a Sabbath. For at that time there will be great suffering, such as has not been from the beginning of the world till now, no, and never will be. If those days had not been cut short, no one would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. If anyone says to you, look, here is the Messiah, or there he is, do not believe it. For false messiahs, false prophets will appear, produce great signs and wonders to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. Take note, I've told you beforehand. So if they say to you, look, he is in the wilderness, do not go out. If they say, look, he's in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and flashes as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the corpse is, there the eagles will gather. Well, let me just say, verse 28 is not a verse that I often quote of Jesus or have a sermon on that. I don't know if you've ever... Anyway, we know what the ravens and the vultures do, right? Again, he's pointing to it will be obvious. There will be some obvious signs, right? But let's go back to the much debated, often misunderstood verse 15 and the words desolating sacrilege. Now, it's not very descriptive, is the first thing I'll tell you. And when there are less than descriptive or less than clear statements in the Bible, particularly in apocalyptic literature, there naturally is going to be a great variety of interpretation. And I'm not here to take something away from you if you know exactly what this is. I would suggest that none of us know exactly what this is. It's nondescript, so many people have pinned the sin du jour, if you will. You pick, some have said it was rock music, video games, abortion, devil worship, or from my Southern Baptist friends, it could simply mean dancing, right? Because anyway, all right. So I was married into a Baptist family, so... Don't laugh now, laugh later then, if you will. Nothing wrong with dancing, right? Anyway. But people will take their pet peeve and pin it on, hey, Jesus warned us against this. This is that sacrilegious thing you shouldn't do. I don't think that's what he was talking about. To be honest, my research would tell us that this specifically is Jesus prophesying about what the Romans are about to do within 40 years, a little bit less than 40 years, AD 70, they're going to come in there and desecrate the sanctuary, the Holy of Holies, the temple, and then they're going to destroy it. What could be worse than that? Anyway, it may also, as I mentioned, biblical prophecy, past, present, future, all are valid. It may also be pointing to something, but can we know what it is? Jesus doesn't say exactly what it is, so something to pray on, right? It can be that in the future there will be an antichrist figure, a figure who is like a world leader, and that world leader wants to set up his image. I say him, right? When it's an evil, the devil is never her, right? I try to use inclusive language, except you never do that when it comes to the devil. All right, so the antichrist, he will put up his image, a statue. Well, in the modern times or in the future, it might be more like a video, some sort of video image in the holy city, Jerusalem. There's no temple now, but it could be on the Temple Mount, could be at the Wailing Wall, could be, who knows. But there are a lot of Christians who believe that, and that could happen. What do I say about perhaps today? Perhaps today God will change the world again, Christ will return, but we just don't know. So I'm less inclined, and I'm encouraging you, hopefully, to be less inclined to pin these labels on any particular person or problem that we face today or group of people that a lot of times Christians might judge or look down their nose at. So I don't think the Bible does not intend for me to know who the Antichrist is. What does Jesus intend? What does the Bible intend? I think is for me to live ready so that I can say honestly, perhaps today, because I'm ready, my family's ready, my church is ready for the end times or the return of Christ. What is the message for the church to believers? I would say, one, not to merely speculate over what the false Messiah might say or do, or what the end times and the suffering might be, or who's making America worse. I'm not here to speculate about that. I think the church is not to retreat into fear-mongering or hiding out from the culture behind our stained glass, but rather engage in that active mission of teaching and reaching people in Jesus Christ. So, again, this emphasis on reaching the nations is prefiguring Christ's Great Commission. Our purpose, the reason that we're here as believers, is to share faith in such a way that others come to believe, not to worry so much about world events. All right, let's go on, because Jesus waxes even more dark, right? In verse 29, how does he get this language? Where's he coming from? The Prince of Peace. Right, okay, verse 29, Matthew chapter 24. Immediately after the suffering of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of heaven will be shaken. If you're reading this, even at home, if you're looking at your Bible, you probably notice the indentation and the way that these verses are set off like lyrics or poetry. Another signal that, well, it can be taken literally, but it's a quote from somewhere. So it's an allusion to the Old Testament prophets. Let me finish reading it first. Verse 30, and the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, meaning the sky at that point. And then all the tribes of earth will mourn. They will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven, the power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, one end of heaven to the other. So where does this language come from? But Jesus is literally quoting prophets of the Old Testament, like Isaiah, Ezekiel, part of Zechariah. We're looking at something where Jesus gives the signs of the times and the signs of the sky in this longer speech, right? He's lifting up both of these things. Portents of destruction of Babylon and Jerusalem and the temple, the destruction of the first temple, midpoint in the Old Testament history, right? So those were the images that were true back then in the past for the disciples. It's certainly all our past, but it also can be fulfilled again in the future. So what I think Jesus is doing, or what a lot of good scholarship would suggest, he is now in the voice of the prophet. He is taking on the mantle of an Elijah or Ezekiel and proclaiming God will change everything. The world as we know it just cannot last. And just as you see the signs in the sky, as you can read, he said this earlier in one of his speeches, earlier in the Gospel of Matthew, right? You know, if it's red sky in the morning, sailor take warning. You know those things. So he's literally not trying to scare us with some doom and gloom apocalyptic language. He's trying to remind us, don't worry about when. Don't sit around trying to figure out if it's Vladimir Putin or somebody else as the Antichrist. Just be ready, because it will be unmistakable when it happens. You know, the signs will be in the sky, just as clear as lightning from one side or the other. That's how you'll see. When Jesus returns, everybody will know it. It'll be announced far and wide, east to west, all the way across the sky. Now, he ends this sort of prophetic, like the prophet. I didn't say pathetic, I said prophetic, like the prophets, right? He ends this prophetic speech with parables. Now we're back to vintage Jesus, because don't you love him when he's telling the parables, right? Because they're very accessible. We can get this. You don't need Pastor J. In fact, you can get up and leave now, all right? Because you got this. You don't need me. There are 7 parables that follow. 3 or 4 of them finish off this chapter, and then there's a couple more in the next. So let's hop right to it. Yeah, we got time. The parable of the fig tree, verse 32. From the fig tree, learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also when you see all these things, you know that he is near, at the very gates. Truly I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all these things have taken place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Let me start with the last verse in that short parable, because this actually could have been placed anywhere in the gospel. Jesus may have said this multiple times, we don't know. But it's one of those wonderful verses that I'm going to make an exception. I usually say don't take verses out of context. But you could just take this one and just put it on your doorpost. You could place this anywhere. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words, Jesus' words. In Matthew particularly, he is portrayed as the new Moses, the new giver of God's word, the new teacher of Torah. It's a Torah that is fulfilled and fully renewed and embodied, personified by Jesus himself. So the way of Jesus and the words of Jesus will not pass away. It's a beautiful saying. It's truth. It's awesome. I do say it's a little worrisome to think of heaven passing away, because heaven is where we want to be forever when we pass away. So understand the various uses of the word heaven. You know, in English, it's a little bit impoverished language compared to the biblical languages. So heavens, particularly when you see it plural, God is the creator of the heavens and the earth, meaning the sky and the land. And in ancient times of more primitive people, you really understood just kind of the world that you're standing on, and the canopy of stars that you could see above were the heavens. But as we understand the kingdom of God and what we call heaven or paradise, where we end up as living forever creatures with God, that's not what's going to pass away. It's the sky and the earth that pass away. But Jesus' words won't, so that's awesome. All right, let me get to the point. Back to where I belong here. Let's go back to verse 32, the fig tree. First, don't stumble on the roots of this parable, teasing you with a little language there. Do you remember the last time he mentioned a fig tree? Oh my goodness. What did he do with the fig tree? We thought Jesus was angry because he was hungry. He was looking for figs, right? And it wasn't the season for figs, but he got angry and he cursed the fig. It wasn't about the tree. And Jesus wasn't hangry, hungry, angry. He was making a point about the nation of Israel. So, some people come to this parable, and I'm not saying they're wrong. Scholars, preachers, make a lot between the connection of the Old Testament language for the fig tree representing the nation of Israel. I would suggest it's much simpler. Jesus, in this speech, in this particular parable, is just talking about a tree. It's springtime. I can point to trees right outside your window. You know it's spring when you see the flowering pear trees. Aren't they pretty? Or the dogwood. There's many more pear trees around, flowering fruit trees, than dogwoods here. But anyway, spring's coming when you see those buds. That's all that Jesus means. You're going to know it. You're just going to see the signs, all sorts of signs in the sky, current events, the way people are, natural disasters, budding of trees, lightning east to west. It's just going to be really obvious when Christ comes. But that's not the point. You don't need all of that. What do you need? Keep the love in your heart from growing cold. Be ready. Live ready. Perhaps today. Can you say that? That's all he's talking about. It's not a big allusion to the Israel as a nation or so on and so forth. It's short and sweet, by the way. Thank God, after all this apocalyptic talk. Well, this one might sound a little more apocalyptic. Let's go to the second parable, the days of Noah. But about that day or hour nobody knows, neither the angels of heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. For as the days of Noah were, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in the days before the flood they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day Noah entered the ark. And they knew nothing until the flood came and swept them away. So too will be the coming of the Son of Man. There will be two in the field, and one will be taken and one will be left. Two women grinding meal together, one will be taken, one will be left. Keep awake, therefore, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. Beautiful. I love that. I mean, you remember the days of Noah. Not you literally. You're not that old. But you understand the story. Right. Thank you for laughing at that. Just make a little note here. I got a joke to land. Check. Seriously, they laughed at Noah, right? God had given Noah this sense, you need to do this now. Build the ark while the sun is shining, right? All of that makes sense. But the larger public didn't understand. They laughed at him. There was no lake within miles and miles and miles. So think about the persecution that Noah and his family had to endure. But the point is, it seemed like business as usual until it wasn't, until it was raining and it never stopped raining, and it was so unusual for them. So same thing in our day and time, or in the future for the tribulation before Jesus returns, however that works. You're going to know it. What you focus on is like Noah. Focus on the task that God has given you. Focus on preparing your heart like the ark to receive that which God has for you to do. Look, verse 36 is so important. I would circle that, highlight that, hold on to that. Because in our conversations as Christians, in a time like we live in, which has all sorts of uncertainties, many fears, I don't minimize the struggle that our world is in, that our nation is in, all the institutions that we've counted upon, whether it be education or marriage or church or what have you, seem to be faltering in one way or another. I don't minimize all of that, but I do pray and encourage you, may your faith be greater than your fears, right? And one thing that I hold on to when somebody pulls me aside and says, don't you think Christ will return? Well, nobody knows the day or the hour, Jesus said himself. Matthew 24, verse 36. The angels don't know. The Son, Jesus himself, doesn't know the day or the hour. God's got that. All right? I like to say this when people ask me to pray for the weather. When I was serving as a young man in a rural setting where it's all farmers that would show up on Sunday mornings, by the way, and that's where we got the 11 o'clock hour for worship in America, is basically on the farming schedule. But anyhow, they would ask me, please pray for rain. You know, it's been real dry this spring. Pray for rain. And I would always have to say, sure, but just to remind you, that's a management decision. I'm only in sales. Okay? You understand what I mean? Same thing with the return of Christ. Or, you know, people want to speak judgment on a certain class of people or a certain group of people or a certain nation. That nation's got to be the Antichrist. I don't know. Only God knows. That's a management thing, so I can't pass judgment. But I need to get ready, and I need to encourage you to get ready. Jesus says it really plainly. Two will be doing something, and one will make it, one will be left behind. That's where you get the story for the series of books called the Left Behind series, if anybody followed along or saw the films for that. I'll talk a different time about that, not right now. But keep awake is Jesus' point. Be ready. Be ready. Now, what do you make of verses 40 and 41? Two will be doing something, one will be left. I'm going to tie this back to where Jesus said, many are called, but few are chosen. And I think to render the English from the Greek better is to say, many people experience God's call, only a few choose to listen to it, to follow it. Right? So God calls everyone, only a few choose to listen, to follow Jesus, ultimately follow him all the way to the cross. So I don't think this is, verse 40 and 41, I don't think it's properly about the rapture. Although many Christians in the way we read the New Testament, very few verses about rapture. But we can kind of look backward and apply that idea on this. So I'm not saying that's wrong. But I do think what Jesus is saying to the disciples, and even to us right now, is, you know, you all understand the truth about the gospel. Jesus might be saying, you all were with me when I told you about the Sermon on the Mount. There's a way to live right. There's a way to be a good human being in the world and a believer and to share blessings. And God is with you in all of this. There are a few people who choose that way of life. And there's a lot of people who hear about it. There's a lot of people who hear Jesus' way of understanding God's Word. There's only a few who take it up. So one will be there and found faithful, and the other will be left behind. It doesn't say behind, but that's the expression I'm trying to use here. So not necessarily at the rapture moment, but even right now, there are fewer people who choose to follow the way of Jesus. And what is he saying? To be ready, got to keep awake. You don't know the hour. Don't worry about the hour because it's going to be as plain as day, like lightning flashing, like, the fig tree. It's going to be plain as day. Here's another example, he says, parable of the thief. Understand this. If the owner of the house had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and would not have let his house be broken into. Therefore, you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. Well, true, if the homeowner knew, or if you were worried about thieves, just move into Ashby Ponds, where they got a gate, security, all this. You're right. You got friends, neighbors right around you. Wonderful. But the point is not home security. The point is the coming of the Lord, the second coming of Jesus in this case, it'll happen at an unexpected moment, unexpected hour. And Jesus tells all sorts of parables, and you've heard all sorts of sermons on these parables about that. So the point is, just be ready when? Always. Perhaps today you'll get ready. I'm ready. Hope you'll be ready. All right, another parable. Yes, and we'll wrap up on this one, and I'll take your questions. Not that I've got good answers, but I'll try my best. The good and wicked servants. Listen to this parable. Verse 45 to the end of chapter 24. Who then is the faithful and wise slave whom his master has put in charge of his household to give the other slaves their allowance, food at the proper time? Blessed is that slave whom his master will find at work when he comes. Hey, by the way, thank God Jesus does get back to blessings. We've heard so many woes. Here's another blessing. Verse 47. Truly I tell you, he will put that one in charge of all his possessions. But if that wicked slave says to himself, my master's delayed, begins to beat his fellow slaves and eats and drinks with drunkards, the master of that slave will come on a day when he does not expect him, at an hour he does not know. He will cut him to pieces and put him with the hypocrites, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Ouch. It does end on a kind of a harsh note, though. But there was a blessing in there. All right, good. So we see both Jesus as the merciful and also justice. We see this in the church as well, by the way. It's always a mixed body. Among believers in all times and places, you have faithful servants and you have foolish servants. You have authentic believers and those who just say they believe, giving God lip service mainly, putting on a show. They have the outward trappings of religion, but only the outward, because the heart is cold. And this could be, he's left the temple now. They're on the Mount of Olives, which is the mount kind of looking over at the temple in Jerusalem. So they're outside the city gates. This could be one of his last sort of poking at the political leadership of the religious authorities, the Pharisees, because they were certainly those servants who just started to beat others, at least morally, legalistically, beat up on people. The hypocrite, he uses the term hypocrite, so it leads me right back to the Pharisees, where the heart is lacking. Christianity, we have not been much better than other religions in the world. Because we have a mixed group of people, always in our churches, not trying to judge somebody, not trying to say I'm always the righteous one. That's not what I mean. But false religion, kind of a fake Christianity, these things happen. When Christ returns, he will weed out the chaff from the wheat, the authentic and the phony, the sheep and the goats. He's going to go on and tell those parables in the next chapter. So that's what this is about. And of course, the implication is, Jesus' imperative is, be like the faithful servant. Stay busy at your task. Keep sharing the faith, reaching other people with the love of God in Jesus Christ is really the ultimate point here. Oh, can I sum them up? Because some of you say that you like having this little summary at the end. So I'm going to sum up chapter 24. This is where the teacher might say, and the moral of the story is, right? Here's what you can take home. Believe in Jesus. That is to say, all of Matthew's gospel, remember, is showing credentials, the authority and identity of Jesus as Christ, Savior of the world, or Son of God. And he's also Son of David. He's the Jewish Messiah, in line with King David, in line with the prophets, and so on, right? So believe in who Jesus truly is, his real identity. And if you believe in that, then be ready. Be ready for anything. Endure trial and tribulation. Suffering will happen to faithful believers. So in a lot of ways, the apocalyptic literature, whether it's Jesus or the book of Revelation, serves us well to dispel some sort of misnomer, misunderstanding. That is, as if being a Christian means you'll only experience blessings. The blessings are not that everything is shiny and happy for Christians. It's that God is with us in suffering, and that whatever pain you experience in life, it's redeemed on the cross, such that your own wounds become wounds of redemption, the suffering that heals. Yes, this sort of righteous suffering. So endure and stay ready to the end. All right, that was kind of the first point. Sorry if that sounded long. Yeah, occupational hazard, right? Preachers make a lot out of the little. All right, Second point I would say in these parables or in this chapter, don't be fooled by what's false, right? Jesus' return will be unmistakable. There will be people who claim, I know that the date of Armageddon is such, and there was in American history, one of the Millers. There are a lot of Millers. His name will come to me, I'm sure, when I've left the class. Anyway, this happens when you get older. So there was this man in the 1800s who had 10,000 Christian followers that kind of became like a little cult and said the end of the world is on October 12th or whatever in 1842. And all the Millerites would gather, and they were ready. And they were ready for the rapture or the return of Christ, and it didn't happen. Well, wouldn't you know that he went back to the Bible and did some other figuring. There's a lot of numerology, a lot of this, when people try to figure out the last dates. And he claimed, I had it wrong, I've ciphered it again, now it's going to be October 31st. And, about half those people stuck with him until the second date was obviously wrong, because here we still are, right? So Jesus didn't come on the second one that he predicted, but he still had like a third of his followers with him when he predicted the third one, but it just eventually it died out and everything. Jesus didn't come back. But there have always been a lot of people claiming a lot of grand knowledge or predicting who is the Antichrist, the end times, prepping for disaster, all these things. That's not the point. Jesus is simply saying, don't be fooled by any false teaching. Stay true to me. My return will be unmistakable. The whole world will know it, like lightning in the sky. You can't miss it. All right, the final point, moral of the story today, is vigilance. All right, and this will be unpacked even more in chapter 25. Keep awake. Be ready. That type of vigilance in our faith today is not a passive, just watch and wait and see, but an active and engaged servant ministry to do the things that Jesus did, good deeds, acts of compassion and devotion. Focus on your own heart. Don't judge your neighbor or some other group of people. Focus on your own heart to be ready and to live ready. If that sounded like I repeated point one, okay, yeah. It's pretty much the point through this whole thing, so that you and I can say together, perhaps today, because we're ready for the return of Christ. Wow, chapter 24, that was a lot to get through. Questions, comments, or was that crystal clear? I see a question. Hang on.